When a storm breaks, we look for shelter. But what if the storm is just a distraction? Tonight, we're covering 3 accounts of survival against things the rain was trying to hide. A predator in a flooded Pennsylvania cabin, a static-filled nightmare in an Idaho fire tower, and an Iowa farmhouse where the floodwater revealed a basement that shouldn't exist. There is nowhere to go. This is Living with Shadows. I've spent a lot of nights alone in bad weather, more than I can count, but there's a specific 3-day stretch in early November that I haven't been able to fully account for. Even now, years later, not because I don't remember what happened. I remember every detail. It's because when I try to explain it to someone, the rational part of their brain starts working against me, so I stopped trying to explain it. I just carry it. The North Branch of the Susquehanna River runs through a part of Pennsylvania that doesn't get a lot of attention. No tourism, no ranger stations within reasonable distance, just ridge lines and river valleys and old logging roads that turn to mud the second the weather shifts. I was 3 days into a solo hike when the flash flood warning came through on my satellite communicator. Not a watch, a warning. That's the kind of language the National Weather Service uses when they're confident. By early afternoon, the trail had started to disappear. Not a road, disappear. The ground was absorbing water faster than it could drain, and what had been a clear path through the hardwoods that morning was already ankle-deep in moving water by the time I hit the lower valley. The sky had dropped to maybe 200 feet of visibility, the kind of gray that doesn't let any light through. Heavy, pressurized, like the atmosphere itself was pushing down. I made a decision to stop moving and find shelter. I remembered seeing a small fishing cabin marked on an old survey map of the area, a seasonal structure sitting on stone piers at the fork of 2 tributary streams. I estimated it was less than a mile south. What I didn't account for was how fast those 2 streams were rising. I found the cabin at roughly 4:30 in the afternoon, just as the last usable light was going. It was a cedar box, simple, 1 room. The kind of structure built for function rather than comfort. I forced the door against the wind, got it shut behind me, and stood there in the dark for a moment, just listening to the rain on the tin roof. It was a deafening sound, a relentless metallic roar that filled every corner of the room and drowned out everything else, including my own breathing. I swept my flashlight across the space, wood stove in the corner, heavy oak dining table in the center. Bare floorboards. Nothing else. Through the gaps in the floor planks, I could already see water moving. The 2 streams outside had merged into a single wide channel, and the brown water was lapping steadily at the stone foundation. I had maybe 12 inches of clearance before the floor flooded. I checked my watch and set a routine. Every 15 minutes, I would shine the light through the gaps and check the level. Then I sat down with my back against the table leg and waited. For the first hour, nothing changed. The water held. The foundation was solid. The rain stayed loud and constant. I had no reason to feel anything except cold. Then the wind stopped. It didn't ease off gradually, it just stopped. The way sound stops when you cover your ears. And in that sudden silence, the rain on the tin roof sounded different, thinner, and underneath it, steady and low, I heard something else, a rhythmic thumping coming from directly beneath the floorboards. I held still and listened. It wasn't the cabin settling. It wasn't water pressure against the foundation. It had a cadence, measured, deliberate, like something making contact with the underside of the floor at regular intervals. I got down on my knees and pressed my ear to the wood. The moment I did, it stopped. I stayed there, ear to the floor, for a full minute. Nothing. Just the rain and the sound of the water moving outside. I sat back up, clicked the flashlight back on, and that's when I noticed the silt. Along one of the seams between the floorboards, a thin, dark trail of wet sediment had been pushed upward. I stared at it for a long moment. The rational explanation was straightforward. Floodwater forcing river mud through the gaps under pressure. I reached out and touched it. It was cold, thicker than I expected, more viscous. I told myself it was just saturated clay and wiped my hand on my pants. I climbed onto the oak table to get off the floor. The thumping started again almost immediately, but it had moved. It was now directly underneath the table. I want to be precise about what I heard over the next hour because it's the part people struggle with most. The sound moved, not randomly, in a slow, deliberate circuit around the perimeter of the table legs. Whatever was making contact with the underside of the floor was tracking the table. I sat in the center of it, flashlight on, listening to this circuit repeat itself every 4 to 5 minutes. The water outside had reached the top of the stone piers. A thin line of moisture was already seeping under the door. Then the thumping stopped again, replaced by something I wasn't prepared for. A sound like something exhaling, long and slow, pushing up through the floorboards. A drawn-out rasp of air moving through a narrow space. Not the sound of wind, not the sound of water displacement. The sound of something that had lungs, breathing in a space directly beneath where I was sitting. I understood then that the crawl space wasn't flooded yet. The water table outside was still an inch or two below the air pocket under the cabin floor. And something was using that air pocket. The floorboards near the wood stove began to bow upward, not all at once, in a slow, progressive arc like something was applying steady upward pressure from below. Then a knot in the wood gave way near the center of the room, and the hole it left was dark, and the smell that came through it was immediate and foul. Stagnant water and something organic underneath it, something that had been submerged and decomposing for a long time. I stayed on the table. I didn't move toward the hole. I pointed the flashlight at it and kept it there. I'm not going to describe what I saw in detail because honestly, I'm not confident in my own perception of that moment. The conditions were extreme. I was hypothermic and alone and operating on no sleep. What I can tell you is that I saw movement in the dark below the hole. Something large and pale shifting in the water. And I heard, distinctly, unmistakably though, the sound of something inhaling again. Slowly, like it was in no hurry. The floorboards near the stove buckled sharply after that, a section giving way with a crack I felt through the table legs. The smell intensified. I heard something moving through the water below, not thrashing, not violent, just a slow and deliberate displacement of water. Patient, methodical. A tree trunk struck the exterior wall. The cabin lurched hard to one side. The table slid. I grabbed the edge, found my footing, and made a decision in about 2 seconds. I threw myself toward the window, hit the glass with my elbow, got it open, and pulled myself through onto the narrow exterior ledge. The water outside was moving fast. I pressed my back against the cedar siding, got my arms around a roof support beam, and held on. I spent 6 hours on that ledge in freezing rain before the water dropped enough to move. At first light, I dropped into the mud and walked. I didn't stop. I hit a forest road 3 miles out and sat down in the middle of it. A maintenance crew found me an hour later. Severe hypothermia. I was in the hospital for 2 days. When I asked whether anyone had gone back to check the cabin, I was told the structure had been largely destroyed by the current. Floorboards gone, interior gutted. The stone foundation was still standing, but the rest had been swept clean. I didn't ask any follow-up questions after that. There was nothing in that answer that made me feel better, and I didn't think any other answer would either. I still don't hike the Susquehanna drainage in November. Some decisions are easy to make. The water has receded, but the isolation is only getting higher. Our next account comes from an Idaho fire lookout, where the storm didn't bring rain. It brought something else entirely. Marcus worked 3 seasons as a fire lookout before the August that ended his career in the forest. He's described the night to investigators twice. Once immediately after and once 6 months later when he'd had time to organize his thoughts. Both accounts are consistent in every detail except one. In the first account, he said he didn't know what was outside the glass. In the second, he said he did know, and that was the part he couldn't explain to anyone without watching their expression change. The Blackwood Fire Lookout sits at 6,000 feet in the Clearwater National Forest of northern Idaho. 14 by 14 feet of glass and steel mounted on a 50-foot tower. The view in clear weather is 360 degrees of unbroken wilderness. The nearest ranger station is 22 miles by road. Marcus had been alone up there for 11 days when the lightning storm moved in from the west. This was a dry storm. No rain, no relief from the heat that had been building for 2 weeks. Just a barrage of static electricity moving across the peaks, touching off spot fires across the ridgeline. By 10 that night, the sky was a constant flicker of blue-white light, and the air inside the lookout smelled of ozone and scorched pine. Marcus was plotting strike locations on his map when the primary radio began to behave strangely. It started as a low hum underneath the usual atmospheric interference. Not white noise, something with a rhythm to it. He adjusted the squelch, tried different frequencies, got nothing useful. He noted the time, 12:15, and reached for his Zippo lighter, a habit he'd developed in his first season. Flicking the lid open and shut, the small mechanical sound of it helped him think. The radio cut to silence. Then a voice came through the speaker. He described it as layered, like someone had recorded his own voice and stacked the recording several times, slightly out of sync. The transmission was not a weather report or a fire alert. It described what Marcus was doing at that moment. Not in general terms, specifically. Subject is holding the lighter. Subject is looking at the north window. Marcus did not move. He lived alone in a glass structure 50 feet off the ground. The only way up was a steel staircase bolted to the outside of the tower. He would have heard footsteps on the grating. There was no one within 20 miles. He turned slowly toward the north window. The lightning flashed. He could see the jagged peaks clearly, the tops of the firs bending in the wind. The forest was empty. He sat for a long moment, telling himself it was a stray transmission. Some kind of atmospheric reflection, bouncing a signal from another station, scrambled by the static into something that only sounded like words. He reached out to turn the radio off. The voice came back before his hand reached the dial. Subject is reaching for the power. He pulled his hand back. He stayed in his chair. He kept his breathing even and his eyes on the north window. That's when he noticed that the window wasn't reflecting the interior of the tower the way it should have been. He had an LED lantern running on his desk, bright enough to light the whole room. The reflection of it should have been visible in the glass. Instead, the north window was completely black. Not dark, black. Like something was pressed against the outside of it, blocking any reflection from coming back. At 50 feet of elevation, nothing should be able to press against the outside of that window. He did not go to the glass. He picked up his Zippo and held it. The radio hum returned, lower than before, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Not gradually and sharply, the way a freezer door opening drops the air around you. Marcus watched his breath mist in front of his face. The thermometer on the wall dropped from 70 degrees to the low 30s in under a minute. He noted this specifically in both accounts. He said the cold had a quality to it that was different from weather cold. Still and pressurized, like being in a sealed room. The blackness on the north window began to spread. It moved to the east pane, then south, then west. Slowly and steadily, the way a shadow moves when a cloud crosses the sun, except there was no single source causing it. By the time it reached the west window, the entire lookout was enclosed. The lightning was still firing outside. He could see it through the gaps where the blackness hadn't fully reached. But the flicker was distant now, like watching a storm from underwater. Something landed on the roof. He felt it through the floor before he heard it. A single heavy impact on the steel above him, followed by a long, low groan of the metal under pressure. He looked up at the ceiling. A second impact, heavier, then stillness. The radio came back at full volume, distorted beyond the layered voice. Just static now, dense and loud enough to vibrate the pens on his desk. Inside the static, he could make out something that might have been language. He couldn't identify the words. He said it sounded like multiple transmissions playing simultaneously. Not two or three, but many, layered so densely they canceled each other into noise. Then the glass on the north window began to crack. Not from an impact, from pressure. A slow inward bowing of the heavy safety glass, the way glass looks when it's being pushed from outside by something steady and deliberate. Marcus got under the steel desk. He pulled his knees to his chest. He held the Zippo against his sternum. The glass didn't shatter outward. The pane failed inward, cracking first, then collapsing into the room in a rush of freezing air that hit him like water. The cold outside the tower was not the ambient temperature of a summer night at elevation. He described it as the kind of cold that has no bottom to it, that doesn't plateau when it reaches you. He struck the Zippo. The moment the flame came up, the pressure in the room changed. He described it as a physical shift, the kind of equalization you feel when a door opens in a sealed space. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the emergency flare kit bolted to the underside of the desk, pulled a magnesium flare, and struck it. The room went red. The weight on the roof lifted. He heard the metal spring back, one sharp resonant clang and then nothing. The black on the remaining windows dissolved within seconds and the lightning outside was suddenly visible again. The storm still moving across the ridgeline like nothing had happened. Marcus went down the stairs at full speed and didn't stop moving until he reached his truck. He drove to the ranger station in Orofino and sat in the parking lot until daylight before he could bring himself to go inside. A search team reached Blackwood Lookout the following afternoon. The tower was standing. One window pane was missing, the north pane consistent with Marcus's account. The steel roof had 2 depressions in it that the structural assessment described as consistent with compression from a significant downward force. No cause was identified. Every electronic device in the lookout had failed. The radio, the monitoring equipment, Marcus's digital watch, which he'd left on the desk, all of them showed the same failure mode. The internal components had been damaged by heat exposure, from the inside out. Marcus moved to the desert after his medical leave ended. A flat place, open in every direction, no forest, no high ground. He hasn't worked a fire season since. He kept the Zippo. Some nightmares come from the sky, but others are already waiting beneath your feet. Our final story takes us to an Iowa farmhouse where a derecho uncovered a door that was never meant to be opened. Greg bought the farmhouse in May with the kind of optimism that only comes from never having renovated a house before. He'd tell you that himself. A 1920s two-story on the outskirts of Council Bluffs, Iowa. Foreclosure sale, cash purchase, keys handed over in a parking lot. The plan was to gut the kitchen over the summer and be done before winter. He was 3 weeks into the work when the derecho came through. If you're not familiar with the term, a derecho is a straight-line windstorm, not a tornado. There's no rotation, no defined path you can track and predict. It's a wall of wind moving in a single direction at hurricane force, sometimes stretching 300-400 miles wide. The National Weather Service had issued a watch for that part of Iowa by early afternoon. By 6 in the evening, it had been upgraded to a warning. By 7, Greg was in his basement listening to the house come apart above him. He'd found the key 2 weeks earlier, taped to the back of the furnace with electrical tape that had dried to a brittle yellow. Old iron, heavy for its size, visibly rusted. He'd tried it on every lock in the house out of curiosity, found nothing it fit, and kept it in his pocket. He couldn't explain why. He said it just felt like something that belonged to the house, and since he was in the process of learning what the house was, he held on to it. The basement was a concrete box, one hanging bulb, a pull string. He'd been down there 20 minutes when the storm peaked. The sound was difficult to describe. He said it wasn't like wind he'd heard before. It was continuous and pressurized, like standing next to a runway. The floorboards above him flexed visibly with each gust. Something heavy fell in the kitchen, then something heavier. That's when the north wall moved, not the concrete. A a section of plywood paneling he hadn't paid much attention to during his walk-through. The pressure differential between the storm outside and the sealed basement was enough to buckle it, and it came away in one piece, swinging inward and landing flat on the concrete floor. Greg stood there with his flashlight pointed at what was behind it. Not more concrete, a narrow crawl space, maybe 3 feet wide, cut into the foundation. And at the end of it, set flush into the floor, a wooden hatch. The hatch was secured with an iron bolt, the kind of heavy, hand-forged hardware you don't find in anything built after the 1940s. Greg moved into the crawl space, bent down and shone his light along the seams of the door. That's when he noticed something that stopped him cold. The dust on the crawl space floor wasn't blowing toward the storm, it was moving toward the hatch. Fine particles of debris drifting steadily into the thin gaps around the wooden door, as if the space below was pulling air inward. He put his hand flat against the wood. The suction was faint but unmistakable. A slow, rhythmic draw of air like the space beneath had a respiratory cycle of its own. He stayed in the crawl space for a few minutes, just watching the dust move. Above him, something structural gave way in the kitchen. He heard the crack clearly. A floor joist, he thinks, or a load-bearing wall beginning to shift. Debris hit the basement floor through a gap that hadn't been there before. Greg made the decision fast. He slid the iron bolt back, lifted the hatch, and lowered himself through. The bolt had been stiff with rust. But when he pressed the key against the iron hardware on instinct, he still can't explain why he did it. The key snapped against the bolt with a magnetic force that caught him off guard. He stood there for a moment, the key stuck fast to the iron. He worked it free, pocketed it, and went down. Stone steps, narrow and wet. A fine green moss covering the risers. Old growth, undisturbed for a long time. He counted the steps as he descended. He stopped counting at 50. The chamber at the bottom was circular, maybe 15 feet across, field stone walls laid by hand. No mortar he could see. Just fitted stone. The air was completely still and roughly 10 degrees colder than the basement above. The sound of the derecho was gone. Not muffled, gone. He said the silence had a density to it, the kind of quiet that makes your own heart beat audible. In the center of the room was a wooden table. On the table was a rotary telephone. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at it for a long time. The wire from the handset ran down the table leg and across the floor and disappeared into a hole in the stone. Not a conduit, not a wall jack, just a hole in the field stone floor roughly the diameter of the cable. He didn't touch it. He didn't approach it. He stood with his back against the staircase wall and watched the room. He was down there for 4 hours. He's reluctant to describe everything he experienced in that time. What he'll say is this: the rhythmic suction he'd felt through the hatch door continued throughout. A slow, regular movement of air that had no visible source. At several points, the temperature dropped in a way that felt localized, like stepping through a cold patch in a lake, except he wasn't moving. And at some point in the 3rd hour, he became aware of a sound beneath the floor. Not the storm. Something lower and slower, a vibration more than a sound that he felt in his sternum more than heard with his ears. He didn't investigate it. He sat on the bottom step with his flashlight between his knees and waited. When the storm passed, he knew it by feel before he heard it. The pressure in the chamber shifted. The air became slightly less dense, and the suction near the hatch door eased. He went up the stairs without looking back at the room. He slid the bolt, climbed out, pulled the hatch shut behind him. He spent the night in his truck parked at the edge of the property and drove to his sister's house in Omaha at first light. He came back 3 days later with a structural engineer to assess the storm damage, which was significant. Roof partially stripped, one exterior wall compromised, kitchen destroyed. He didn't mention the hatch to the engineer. After the assessment, he went to the basement alone. The plywood panel was still on the floor where it had fallen. He pushed it aside and shone his light into the crawl space. Solid concrete, poured, unbroken, no seam, no hatch, no indication that anything had ever been cut into the foundation at that location. He spent an hour in that crawl space with a flashlight and a tape measure. He checked twice. The dimensions of the concrete matched the original 1924 construction plans he'd pulled from the county assessor's office when he bought the house. There was no record of any modification to the foundation, no permit, no contractor, no documentation of any kind indicating that anything had ever been built beneath it. Greg listed the farmhouse in July. He took a loss on it and didn't care. He lives in an apartment in Omaha now, 4th floor, no basement. He still has the iron key. He keeps it in a drawer and doesn't carry it anymore. He couldn't tell you exactly why. Something about the weight of it bothers him now in a way it didn't before that night. He said it feels different than it used to. Lighter. Like something that was stored in it got used up. If something in these accounts stayed with you, subscribe. There's more where this came from. And if you have a story of your own, leave it in the comments. Some of the best ones come from people who weren't looking for anything strange. This is Living with Shadows.